Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime video. I hope you guys are all having a fantastic day so far. So for today's video, I kind of wanted to do an extension of my last video where I did a voiceover discussing the story of Dan Markel's death and the conspiracy behind his murder. So if you haven't watched that one, or if you haven't been following this case elsewhere, I recommend watching that video first. Otherwise, this video is probably not going to make much sense because we are going to be discussing Wendi Adelson and her likely or possible involvement in the conspiracy to murder her ex-husband, Dan Markel. Now, before we get started, I did want to preface this by saying that Wendi Adelson is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. She has not been charged with any crimes relating to the death of her ex-husband. This is all my personal opinion based on the information that I've gathered from a number of public sources, including her police interview, her testimonies, and the number of trials that she's testified in regarding this case, newspaper articles, and so on. Now, in my previous video, I had touched on the divorce between Dan Markel and Wendi Adelson. And I really didn't even do it justice in that video because this divorce was perhaps the most contentious divorce that I've ever come across. Dan Markel and Wendi Adelson were in the trenches of a highly tumultuous divorce, a divorce that Dan Markel likened to Pearl Harbor, as he had come home early from a business trip and found his house completely bare. Wendi had taken everything and their children and left the house, leaving nothing but a stack of divorce papers awaiting Dan Markel's signature. Now, Dan wasn't prepared to give up on their marriage. He was ready to do whatever he could to make this marriage work. But unfortunately, Wendi had already had her mind made up and there was no turning back. Now, it took some time, but after a while, Dan Markel finally accepted the divorce. And reportedly, he was kind of rolling over, prepared to give Wendi Adelson everything that she had asked for, until Wendi wanted to take the boys and move to South Florida, nearly 8 hours away from Markel's home in Tallahassee. So when Wendi Adelson filed a petition to relocate, Dan was no longer playing nice. He was a loving, dedicated father, and he was not going to sit by and just let his children be effectively taken away from him. Now, at this point, their divorce was getting increasingly litigious as Dan Markel would file a motion against Wendi and Wendi would file one back. Stakes were raised when Dan Markel filed sanctions against Wendi Adelson's lawyer, accusing the attorney of aiding Wendi in hiding nearly $500,000 in assets. Tensions rose, animosity accumulated like a volcano on the brink of eruption. But all of that would be put to rest on July 18th when Dan Markel pulled into his garage to be fatally ambushed by an unknown assailant. Now, years passed before the shooter was identified as Sigfredo Garcia. He and his accomplice, Luis Rivera, were hired by Wendi Adelson's brother, Charlie Adelson, who was convicted in Markel's murder in 2023, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, a week after the conviction of Charlie Adelson, the matriarch of the family, 74-year-old Donna Adelson, was captured at the Miami airport with her husband Harvey as they were attempting to flee the country with one-way tickets to Vietnam, a country without extradition. In other words, if they had made it to Vietnam, there is no treaty between the United States and Vietnam for them to be brought back to face their charges in the United States. So Donna Adelson was arrested, and she now faces the same charges that Charlie Adelson was found guilty of. As her trial approaches, which has recently been delayed due to some other nonsense going on with her attorney, which so happens to be the same attorney that represented Charlie Adelson, Daniel Rashbaum, who, just as a side note, it looks as if he has stepped down, so he will no longer be representing Donna Adelson. But as Donna's trial is approaching, there's still much debate around Wendi Adelson. Some believe that she is completely innocent and she was unaware that this conspiracy was taking place, even though she continues to defend her brother and her mom, believing that they had no part in Dan Markel's murder. While others believe that Wendi Adelson was the mastermind behind the murder plot. As for me, the devil's in the details. And here's why I believe she was involved. Let's start off with the obvious. Nobody was going to benefit from the death of Dan Markel to the extent of Wendi Adelson. Wendi made it abundantly clear to just about everybody who knew her that she hated Tallahassee. She wanted to leave and she wanted to move back to South Florida so she can be near her family. And the only thing that was stopping her was Dan Markel after her petition to relocate was denied by the court. So she was stuck in Tallahassee for the foreseeable future. And listen, on the stand, Wendi completely denies that she hated Tallahassee. She denies that she felt stuck there. In fact, she says that when the motion to relocate was denied, she felt a sense of relief because she had a nice life in Tallahassee and she liked her job. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Emails and text messages between Wendi and her mother, Donna Adelson, greatly contradict her testimony. In fact, one of the emails stated that the top priority of this divorce was relocation, and that wasn't possible with Dan Markel in the way. Through this divorce, Dan Markel had also accused Wendi of hiding nearly $500,000 in assets, and Dan intended to sanction her lawyer and have Wendi disbarred, as such ethical behavior would deem Wendi unfit to practice law. So Wendi, kids aside, had a lot to lose with Dan Markel in the picture. So the motive for Wendi's involvement in Dan Markel's death is certainly there. Now, this may seem a little paradoxical at first, because having a solid alibi should prove that you're not involved, right? And here's the deal. Wendi's alibi is rock solid. It's tight. There's no questioning it. Even before the shooter was identified, it was clear that Wendi Adelson could not have been the one to pull the trigger. But as I listened to her police interview and her testimonies over and over again, her alibi seems a little too tight. On the morning of July 18th, which was the day that Dan Markel was shot, a TV repairman from Best Buy, also known as the Geek Squad, was scheduled to go to Wendi Adelson's house on that morning to repair Wendi's TV. So after some discussion with the TV repairman, Wendi apparently had asked him how much it was going to cost to have this repair done. She calls her brother, Charlie Adelson, who we now know has been convicted for the murder. She calls Charlie, and the two of them decide that it would make more financial sense just to buy a whole new TV. So Wendi has decided not to get the TV repaired after all, but just to buy a new TV. But she still decides it's important to get the name and the contact information of this repairman. Why would that be necessary if she's just going to buy a new TV? Now alone, this might not seem like much, but as these pieces come together, it seems as if she was intentionally building her alibi piece by piece. And remember that during Charlie Adelson's trial, we found out that TV had been code for the murder all along. So the fact that Wendi Adelson is getting her TV repaired on the morning of the murder just seems a little too coincidental for me. Now, after the TV repairman leaves her home, Wendi then goes to a liquor store where she remembers having a conversation with the salesman as he mentioned something about how blue her eyes were and she was asking him for recommendations as to what type of bourbon to buy for a Stock the Bar party that she was going to attend.
Yeah.
The one at Benton Road?
ABC Liquors, it's at, yeah, Benton. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Did you make a purchase there?
Yeah,
And that was sometime after 12?
probably 12:30.
Okay. All right.
And I talked to a guy there because I don't really buy much alcohol, and so they wanted bourbon, and I asked the guy, we had a whole conversation about bourbon, and
Right.
my eyes, like,
Your eyes?
he just said, your eyes are really blue,
Right.
and
You have contacts?
I do.
Okay.
But I just remembered it.
Right.
So I bought the bourbon and got some gas on Thomasville and met my friends at Mosaic.
This conversation with the salesman just seems so planned to me. It seems as if she wanted to leave some sort of impression with the salesman to ensure that when police inevitably came to verify her story, her alibi would check out and any suspicion of Wendi would cease to exist. Throughout her police interview, Wendi Adelson is forthcoming with information. She is honest and upfront about her contentious divorce with Dan Markel. She seems to be cooperative and voluntarily gives her phone to police. Now, these actions led many people to believe that Wendi Adelson was innocent because she seems to have nothing to hide. But if she truly was a part of planning this murder, she would know that she was going to be a prime suspect. Thus, it would be important for her to cooperate to ensure that they wouldn't be suspicious. But what I find to be strange is that during her interview, she mentions that she is in fear for herself and for her children, that whoever did this to Dan Markel could target them next. However, after this interview, where she told investigators that she's willing and wanting to help them find out who did this to Dan Markel, she completely cut off all communications with the police and directed them to her lawyer. Now, don't get me wrong. I am one who believes that you should get a lawyer before you talk to police. However, if she was in such fear, wouldn't she want to be in contact with the police to know what's going on in the investigation if she was truly in fear that this killer was going to target them next? Wouldn't she want to know if they had any suspects on the person who killed her children's father? Unless, of course, she already knew who did it. Now, if you listen to her interview closely, she seems to know that the killer is somebody close. When discussing who could possibly have done this to Dan Markel, she offers up a disgruntled student, Dan Markel's girlfriend's ex-husband, even her own brother. But it never seems to cross her mind that this murder could have been a robbery gone wrong. Wendi Adelson was able to determine that the motive behind this murder was anger and not just a random attack. Within a year of Dan Markel's death, Wendi Adelson not only left Tallahassee behind, but seemed to leave any trace of Dan Markel behind too. Wendi decided to legally change the last names of their sons from Markel to Adelson. Now, during her testimony, Wendi claims that she did this name change to protect her children from the public, as this case made national headlines, which I can understand that to some degree. But what that doesn't explain is how Wendi Adelson also decided to remove one of the sons' middle names, which referenced Dan Markel's deceased grandmother. So please tell me how that's not effectively erasing any trace of their late father. Not to mention that a decade later, the Adelson family is perhaps even more well known than Markel, as Charlie Adelson has been convicted and Donna Adelson is now facing trial for the murder. So did Wendi decide to change their names back to Markel? She could have even hyphenated their last names to have both Adelson and Markel. But no, because Wendi wants no association with Dan Markel. And that speaks volumes. Wendi Adelson brought up a hitman multiple times within the week of Dan Markel's murder. Now, from what we know for sure, because it is possible she made this comment to other people that we don't know about, but from what we know, within the week of the murder, Wendi Adelson brought it up to her on and off again boyfriend, Jeffrey Lacoste, as she specifically mentioned that her brother, Charlie Adelson, looked into hiring a hitman the year prior when the petition to relocate was denied. Then, during her police interview, before they have any idea what happened to Dan Markel, at least officially, she brings up this quote unquote joke about Charlie hiring a hitman as a divorce present, but buying her a TV instead because it's cheaper, because it's such a funny joke. And I hope that my sarcasm came across here. To the investigator, Wendi admits that her brother Charlie makes a lot of jokes in bad taste. Yet for some reason, Wendi repeats this joke to other people. Why? Usually when someone makes a bad joke, you don't go repeating it to other people. You probably just keep it to yourself. And come to find out, she admittedly also told this joke to the TV repairman who was there on that morning. And statistically speaking, what are the chances that she brings up this joke on the same morning that her ex-husband is killed by a hitman who we find out was hired by her brother? Like, really, what are the chances of that occurring? She brings up this joke twice the same morning that Dan Markel was really killed by a hitman. I understand if she's in the interview room and they're having a conversation about who could have done this, and she's like, hey, I remember my brother making this joke, but why would she bring it up to the TV repairman before she knew, at least officially knew, that Dan Markel would be killed by a hitman? Furthermore, all the times that Wendi talks about this joke, she never mentions a response of hers, like telling Charlie to knock it off and to not joke about killing the father of her children. Now, within the weeks prior to Dan Markel's murder, Wendi Adelson and her on and off again boyfriend, Jeffrey Lacoste, were going through this long, extended, rocky breakup. They were having some issues and trying to figure out if they can work through it. Now, Jeffrey Lacoste was obviously brought in for questioning as he was a suspect. So during his police interview, Jeffrey Lacoste mentioned that the Tuesday, just days before Dan Markel's murder, Wendi called him, telling him that she was locked out of their house and they were supposed to get together that day. So Jeffrey Lacoste offers to go over to her house and they can have this little date on the patio or on the porch while they waited for a locksmith to open the door. Wendi seemed to respond pleasantly to this idea, but before Lacoste made his way over, Wendi said she was able to get into her house and suggested that the two of them go to a yoga session instead. Now, I will say this is just speculation on my part, purely speculation, based on everything that I've seen. I do wonder if Wendi was already getting her stuff ready to leave, knowing that Dan Markel would soon be dead. And the reason why I think this is plausible is because Dan Markel was killed on Friday. She was gone with all of her stuff packed, ready to go to Miami in just 2 days. So is it possible that she didn't really lock herself out of the house, but she just needed an excuse to tell Lacoste why he couldn't come over to her house, because he would surely see all of these boxes packed? In other interviews, we heard how Wendi was cleaning the boys' rooms, and just days before Dan Markel's death, she was giving her friend some hand-me-downs from the boys. So is it possible that she was getting everything ready to leave as soon as Dan Markel was shot? I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know, but it certainly raises some questions. So let's go back to Tuesday night, where Lacoste and Wendi go to a yoga session instead of going to her house. Now, according to Lacoste, earlier that day, even the days prior, Wendi seemed very lovey-dovey in the text messages, suggesting that the boys should call him dad. But then, as soon as they go out on this yoga date, everything seemed to switch. Her entire mood was different. She seemed cold and off-putting. And at the end of the night, Wendi essentially told Lacoste that she was done with him, or at the very least, that she wanted no contact from him for about a week or so.
So she's done with me, right? Okay. I'm looking at her. It's not right. Something's wrong here. I walk out to the car, and it's really awkward. Small talk, you know. I can tell she thinks she's done. But she asked me if I was going to be here this weekend. Now, she's done. Why does she give a shit if I'm here Friday? She asked me directly, are you going to be here Friday? And I said, maybe it's up in the air. And it wasn't up in the air. I just didn't want to seem desperate, and I was just going to stay here and not take my trip if Wendi was willing to see me is what that was about. But she said, but she was really interested. Oh, why is it up in the air? Oh, because, you know, at his end or something. Oh, okay, well, okay, talk to her.
And this was prior to her sending you the email?
Prior to sending me the email, and the last thing I ever heard from Wendi, last words I exchanged with Wendi were, are you going to be here Friday? I just thought you should know that. It may mean nothing, but it was kind of strange to me.
So if Wendi wanted no contact with Jeffrey Lacoste, why would she care what he's doing on that Friday? The same Friday that just so happens to be the day that Dan Markel is shot. It just seems too coincidental to me. Could it be possible that she was framing Jeffrey Lacoste to be the fall guy as the scorned ex-lover with the vendetta against Dan Markel? That's certainly a popular theory. And fortunately for Jeffrey Lacoste, he happened to switch his plans to leave on that Thursday instead of Friday and didn't tell Wendi about it. And I am curious if that really just threw a wrench in their whole plan. Now, some discredit what Jeffrey Lacoste has to say because, let's be honest, he is the ex-boyfriend. However, throughout his police interviews, because he did several, he brought the receipts. He showed text messages and emails that corroborated his story. Furthermore, there were details and things that he mentioned during his interview that evidence wouldn't prove until Charlie Adelson's trial nearly 10 years later. And the details that came out in Charlie Adelson's trial further corroborated everything that Jeffrey Lacoste had to say, which really just shows him to be highly credible. On the flip side, Wendi's police interview and the several testimonies that she has given directly contradict the text messages and emails that she sent to her mom or to Charlie, or the text messages and emails between Donna and Charlie, leaving me to believe that Wendi is a pathological liar. Now, we went over how Wendi Adelson was asking about Jeffrey Lacoste's plans for the day that Dan Markel was murdered. But it gets worse. On July 6th, just a few weeks before Dan Markel's murder, text messages would show Wendi Adelson asking Dan Markel if he was going to be in Tallahassee between July 14th and July 18th. She explains that she wants to know if she can have the kids on the 16th. Now, when she asked this question, Wendi happened to be in South Florida with her family celebrating her father's, I believe it was his 70th birthday. Now, if this entire conspiracy to kill Dan Markel was truly a family affair, it seems as if this would be the perfect time to solidify all of the details. I'd assume that the time of this text message, they were getting everything in order, and Wendi Adelson needed to confirm that Dan Markel would be at home at the time of the hit. The hitmen knew the details of Dan Markel's schedule. This is perhaps one of the greatest indicators that Wendi Adelson was involved in the conspiracy to kill her ex-husband, Dan Markel.
I asked you earlier about him being scheduled to leave town the day after he was killed. Do you know where he was planning to go?
He was going to New York to see his girlfriend.
The message that he left you that morning, do you remember what he told you in the message?
I think it was about our son's school. Other than that, I don't really remember.
Okay. Included in that was it included in that message that he was heading to the gym and was going to be at the gym between 9:15 and 10:30 that morning?
I really don't remember, but that sounds like it could be.
The prosecutor, Georgia Kappelman, was able to verify through transcripts that Wendi Adelson did in fact know the gym and the time that Dan Markel would be there. Through surveillance footage, investigators were able to track the Prius that was following Dan Markel on the morning that he died. Dan Markel was scheduled to leave the state on a business trip on July 19th. According to Luis Rivera, the driver involved in the hit, he specifically mentioned how they knew they had to kill Dan Markel on the 18th before he left the following day. How else would they have known where Dan Markel would be or when he would leave if it hadn't been for Wendi Adelson? According to Rivera's testimony, all of these details were provided by Charlie Adelson through the conduit, Katie McBanua. And Charlie, who apparently loathed Dan Markel, would have had to get this information from Wendi Adelson. And knowing that he made all of these jokes about hiring a hitman and knowing that her brother hates Dan Markel, why else would Wendi Adelson give that information to Charlie Adelson unless she was involved in the conspiracy? Now, bringing it back to Wendi Adelson's police interview. Wendi was picked up from the restaurant where she was having lunch with some friends. Again, I think this lunch date was intentionally set to provide her an alibi, as she mentioned she hadn't seen these friends in a long time, and she just so happens to plan this lunch date on the same day that her ex-husband would be killed. Also, pay attention to the way that she reacts when the investigator mentions that this was a last-minute plan.
I gotta get a form for you to sign, and then I'm gonna get the phone started, okay?
Oh my God. I have a lot of friends.
I know.
How do you know that?
Well, you had two of them up there for a last minute lunch date, right?
Last minute.
Well, I mean, you went up there, you're sitting.
And then I had two friends that I would often meet on Fridays, just kind of last minute. And so we made plans to go have lunch.
So that certainly struck me as odd. But what's even more telling is that Wendi Adelson was never told why she was going to the police station. Officially, Wendi wasn't told about the murder or the shooting of her ex-husband until she was in that interview room.
There was a shooting at your home, or your ex-husband's home, at 2116 Trescott. Okay. Your ex-husband, Daniel, all right, has been taken to the hospital. He's not going to survive.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Within the next 10 or 20 minutes of the interview, she makes a very peculiar statement to the investigator.
Oh my God.
What?
What? Oh my gosh.
What?
I can't believe this is happening.
Okay. All right. Let me go get the form for the phone.
Do I need to be read my Miranda rights or something if you're gonna look at my phone?
I can read you Miranda if you want to hear
I don't
that.
know, I'm just trying to make sure I'm being
I have no
protected.
reason. I have no reason at this point to suspect you in this incident. Okay.
I couldn't tell from the way you were talking to me in the car if I was a suspect.
Well, no, and the reason was I didn't want to get into everything until we got up here.
A suspect of what? Wendi Adelson didn't know what happened at that time. right? Wendi Adelson admitted during her police interview and her testimonies that she drove down Trescott Drive within an hour or so of the shooting of Dan Markel. However, she said that she came across some caution tape and a police cruiser and turned around, as she believed there was maybe a downed tree or perhaps an electrical storm. She explained that she drove by their marital home to come to terms with the divorce, which is weird considering that she initiated it, but okay. She also explained that she used Trescott as a shortcut, even though the maps show that would take her a much longer time to get to her final destination. Additionally, she changed her story again when she claimed she used that route because it was familiar to her. So her story changes multiple times, which is obviously a red flag. But the bigger issue for me is when she saw that caution tape in the police cruiser, she never called Dan to check in and to make sure everything was okay, knowing that he had their boys that morning.
Did you go to the crime scene or very near the crime scene on your way from your residence to, I guess, to lunch or to wherever you were going next?
No, I did not.
So you never turned on Trescott Drive that day?
I went to turn on Trescott Drive, but I saw that it had been blocked off by some tape, and so I just kept driving on Centerville.
Okay, and when you had to turn around at the tape, right, to go back out?
I think I tried to turn right, and it couldn't turn, so I would have made like the kind of turn, like a K-turn, and kept going.
Was there a roadblock there with?
There was tape.
Yeah, and an officer was there?
I didn't see an officer, but I did see a car.
A law enforcement marked vehicle? Okay, did you have any contact with the officer?
No.
Okay. Did you do anything after that to try to find out what was going on down that roadway?
No, I just assumed it was weather, or maybe a tree fell.
Had there been bad weather that day?
No, but it was summertime, and there's electrical storms and trees fall, so that would have been pretty normal for summertime.
Where were your kids supposed to be at the time that you encountered that roadblock?
They would have been at school.
And that's at the creative preschool?
That's right.
Who took them to preschool that day?
Danny.
And who was supposed to pick them up from preschool that day?
Me.
All right, so did you know for sure that they had made it to preschool that day at the time you encountered the roadblock?
I just assumed. I mean, if they hadn't made it to preschool, Danny would have let me know, but
Did you attempt to call Dan Markel when you encountered the roadblock?
no, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think it was related to the house.
And this, as a mother, is the biggest red flag for me. Now, personally, maybe I am too paranoid. You can thank my trauma for that. But when I hear sirens and I know my husband is out taking my boys for a bike ride and I hear sirens, I will call to make sure there wasn't an accident, to make sure they didn't get hit by a car. I call every single time I hear a siren. But if I saw caution tape and a police cruiser near my house, my heart would sink, my stomach would be in knots, and there is not a snowball's chance in hell that I wouldn't call or at least talk to the police officer to see what was going on. Not to mention just going on about my day as if nothing happened. And let me give Wendi the benefit of the doubt really quickly. Let's say that a tree really did get knocked down. Do trees not cause accidents also? Do trees not fall on houses or cars or people? Even if I did think it was a tree that fell, I would still call to make sure that the tree didn't fall on the house or the car or the kids. So I still don't buy her story that she wouldn't call Dan Markel to make sure her children were safe, because that's what any normal mother would do. Unless, of course, they already knew what had happened. Now, Wendi denies that she saw any type of police activity.
We We retraced Wendy's route that day. She would have been coming from Centerville Road, a more commercial street, and she left Centerville to pass through Benton Hills on Trescott Drive, a much more residential road with several caution signs. Then it takes us another 2.5 minutes after leaving Centerville Road to get close to Markel's home on Trescott. Wendi testified to something different. She said she barely made it onto Trescott before she saw police.
I went to turn on Trescott Drive, but I saw that it had been blocked off by some tape, and so I just kept driving on Centerville. There was tape.
Yeah, and an officer was there.
I didn't see an officer, but I did see a car.
A law enforcement marked vehicle.
This is around where that police roadblock would have been, according to the officer on the scene's testimony. Wendi claimed she couldn't see what was happening at Markel's house from her car. It's the one you see there with the brick mailbox. It's about 2 houses from that speed hump sign. And the road winds out to where it's more visible to see that mailbox, but you can't make out exactly because of the trees, the actual house building.
Basically, the investigators and the crime scene techs taking care of their portion. And the crime scene tech vehicles are marked police and have lights on them and stuff.
Would it have been obvious to someone approaching your position in a vehicle that there was activity, law enforcement activity going on at that residence?
It seems likely.
If the roadblock was set up where Officer Bill Brandon recalled, between 3 and 6 houses away from the scene, it appears emergency vehicles parked along this narrow road would have been visible and obvious to drivers, but the car where Markel was ambushed, it would have been out of sight.
According to the officer who actually witnessed Wendy's car drive by the crime scene, he testified that it would have been obvious that there was police activity at the Markel residence, especially considering that's where she had lived. She was familiar with that house, yet she drove by, turned around, and thought nothing of it. That is the biggest load of shit that I have ever heard. So for me, this is the greatest indicator that Wendi was involved, and she at the very least had knowledge of what was going to happen to her ex-husband on that day. Now, the level of her involvement is up for debate. Did she have simple knowledge of what was going to happen and they didn't let her in on every detail so that she could have plausible deniability, perhaps? Or was she the mastermind behind this whole murder? I can't say for sure, but to me, Wendi seems very calculated. She seems highly manipulative. That doesn't mean that she is perfect. I think oftentimes people are like, well, if she is so calculated, why would she bring up all of these details during her police interview? And I think, one, she thinks she's smarter than she is and she makes mistakes. And two, if you've been around people who are manipulative, I've seen people who will steal from you and help you look for what they stole. And I think that's no different in this case here. I think that she tried to hide the truth in plain sight, thinking that it would throw the police off her tracks, and it backfired. Now, at the end of the day, I don't know if Wendi will ever have charges brought against her. And I don't know if the evidence will be enough to convict her, but I certainly hope that investigators have a lot more information than we do. Based on the information that I have, I think it would be enough. However, we don't know what a jury will think. We don't know what the defense she will prove. But in my personal opinion, she knew what was coming. There are just too many coincidences, and her stories just don't make sense. And for the sake of justice, I do hope that the truth will eventually come out and everyone who was involved in the death of Dan Markel is held accountable. But other than that, that is all I have for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Make sure you like this video before you go, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.